This is Chapter 2 on the U.S. Constitution, and we'll be talking about the questions again, as we always do. The first question is, what's the unwritten Constitution and how does it change the government, even though the written Constitution does not change? You can see here what I did was I took a definition of an unwritten Constitution off the internet, and basically it says that the unwritten Constitution is the result of the evolution of customs, usage, judicial decision making, and statutory laws. You put those together and you have an unwritten Constitution. Here's how I like to look at the unwritten Constitution. I consider it to be the laws passed by the legislature that change the Constitution, amendments to the Constitution, actions taken by the President that are not challenged and become accepted, and Supreme Court decisions that change the Constitution. So let me kind of explain some of these. First of all, think about it. We live in the 21st century, and the Constitution was written in the 18th century. So everything that's new, that's discussed or becomes a law, like, for example, civil rights laws that guarantee the right of minorities, particularly African American, but any minorities usually, to participate in the government. That wasn't in the original Constitution. In the original Constitution, the African Americans were slaves. So the Constitution gets changed by laws like that. Same thing when it comes to the rights of women and gays and just about any kind of law that's being passed today, like, for example, the recognition of gay marriage. Amendments to the Constitution, they change the Constitution. Now, some people might argue that that's not the unwritten Constitution, but I see it as part of that as well. So amendments that gave women the right to vote, any and all of the amendments to the Constitution constitute changes in the Constitution which are not in the original document, and therefore I call them part of the unwritten Constitution. Number 3 is actions taken by the President that are not challenged. So the President, and because we have a presidency-centered government, the President is more likely to change the Constitution than anybody else. Some examples of that would have been after 9/11, we became very afraid of terrorism, and there was a lot of talk about the sleeper cells and a lot of talk about that it was going to happen again. So the United States then decided to go to war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in the process of doing that, mainly I would say out of the fear of dealing with terrorists rather than governments, the government of President Bush and Vice President Cheney decided to do things like torture people. Now, that had not been part of the U.S. Constitution before. But as a matter of fact, there was a clear policy that developed out of the Constitution. The unwritten Constitution before that had been that we did not use torture. Going back, as I think I said this in the first lecture, going back to President Washington, at the very beginning of the country. So the president changed that by doing things like that. And a classic example of changing the Constitution, where it's clearly in the Bill of Rights giving people a right to being not only tried, but to be accused of a crime, that you had to be given your rights, and you had to be the crime for which you're being accused has to be identified. You have a right to a lawyer. There's a whole host of things that are now part of the Constitution. And during the scare after 9/11, a guy by the name of Jose Padilla was arrested at O'Hare Field in Chicago and held for 3 years by the U.S. government as a terrorist. He was never charged with anything until the Supreme Court reacted to his case 3 years later. But by that time, he had been held in jail without ever given any of the rights that are in the Constitution. This guy was an American citizen, and held without, not only held for 3 years, but tortured during that time. So when the president does something like that, captures an American citizen, you can even say kidnapping an American citizen, not granting them any of their rights, and holding them for 3 years without ever saying anything other than this person is an enemy combatant. You change the Constitution. You have literally made a situation which goes unchallenged, and because it goes unchallenged, then what happens is that becomes part of the Constitution, meaning every president after that could do the same thing. And the last one would be the Supreme Court, and this is probably the easiest way to see how the Constitution is changed, almost on a kind of every major decision basis that the Supreme Court comes up with. So if the Supreme Court says that the war in Iraq is legal, then that changes the Constitution, because only the Congress, according to the written document, only the Congress is allowed to declare war, and you've got the president doing it because the Supreme Court basically upholds it. On the domestic side, you have things like gay rights, women's rights, all these kind of things that are been identified as legitimate. A woman's right to an abortion, for example. None of that is in the original document. So all of those decisions change the Constitution in the sense of what kind of rights people have, just like the citizens' rights are now questionable after what happened to Jose Padilla. Here are some examples of what you find in the in textbooks on the unwritten Constitution, examples of the unwritten constitutions. The presidential cabinet, where you have all the different secretaries, that wasn't identified in the Constitution under Article 2 that deals with the president. Number 2 is political parties. I think most people probably have heard about that from time to time, that the political parties are not a constitutional entity as such. They just developed out of practice later into the history of the United States. There was some semblance of political parties, more called factions, in the days of Washington and Adams. But after that, the political parties have a kind of origin, the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. The influence of interest groups, that's not in the Constitution at all. They're just regulated to the extent that they are regulated, and we'll talk more about that later, by laws. So the cabinet, political parties, lobby groups or interest groups, and probably the most famous example is judicial review. There's a famous case that almost everybody who studied government in high school came across, and that would be Marbury versus Madison. And in a small part of that case, which really had nothing to do with the case, the Supreme Court said that they had a right to review actions of the president and Congress. That's what's called judicial review, to determine if the actions of the president and Congress are constitutional or not. And that's certainly not in the written Constitution. As a matter of fact, the written Constitution doesn't really say anything about what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. Okay, let me talk about question number 2. How does the U.S. Constitution, written and unwritten, compare? Well, if you look at the left-hand column, what I've got here is the characteristics of what I see as the written Constitution, and then on the right is the unwritten Constitution. Essentially, the problems of the written Constitution are that the language is vague and difficult to understand, it's rigid, it's undemocratic in many places, and it's time-bound. So let me just explain that a little bit. The language is vague and difficult to understand. Like, for example, it says in the Constitution that in order to impeach the president, the president can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. And that statement, high crimes and misdemeanors, it's been subject to a lot of discussion by constitutional scholars over the years, and there's been no real consensus as to what that means, what the terminology was meant to mean. Does it mean that the president can only be kicked out if he shoots somebody, or does it mean that if he gets a traffic ticket, that he would be subject to impeachment? What happens, because the language is so ambiguous, the Congress, the Congress which has the power to impeach the president, they get to decide what it means. So, for example, when President Clinton was impeached, they decided that the impeachment was based on the fact that he lied under oath about his sexual activity with Monica Lewinsky. So that's their definition of high crimes and misdemeanors. The second thing is that it's rigid. That is to say, it's very difficult to change it by the amendment process. The amendment takes a 2/3 vote, and it's almost impossible to get 2/3 on anything. So, just look at the number of amendments. Go back and look in the end of your textbook and look at the Constitution and look at the amendments. There's very few amendments relative to how long the Constitution's been around. So why is that? Because we don't change it? No, of course we change it all the time. We change the Constitution all the time, but not through the written document. We change it through the unwritten document. The third thing is that it's undemocratic. That is, a lot of, not the whole Constitution, but many of the things in the Constitution are undemocratic. For example, probably the most common one that people think of is the Electoral College. The public gets to vote on who the president is going to be, but in effect there's a group of people called the Electoral College that actually technically decide who the president's going to be. They vote on it afterwards. And if you go back to a time like Gore versus Bush, when he ran against Gore, Gore won the popular vote, but Bush was awarded the Electoral College vote after the Supreme Court decided that he would get the key votes in those states that were being contested. So that's undemocratic. Probably another good example of the undemocratic nature of the Constitution is the Supreme Court. It's kind of funny, I've been saying that for years, that the 9 judges, particularly when it's a 5-4 decision, but anytime, 9 judges shouldn't be deciding what the laws ought to be. And lo and behold, when gay marriage was upheld by the Supreme Court, conservatives started to say that. And so here I find myself on the same side as conservative Republicans who were essentially saying the same thing, that 9 judges shouldn't be deciding what's best for the people in the United States. And then the last thing is it's time bound. The Constitution, the written Constitution, is limited by the fact that it's really was written in the 18th century, and there's no way that the people in the 18th century could have anticipated the problems we would have in the 21st century. So here we are, we're for example, we're in a technological age where there's computers and information collected on all of us when we use cell phones, when we use social media, all this kind of thing. And so when you think of the concept of privacy, when you think of the fact that the Constitution says that you have a right to privacy, that the government shouldn't be invading your right to be alone and away from the government, when those people in the 18th century were thinking about it, they were thinking about your right to your privacy in your home. And they didn't have any idea, and you can't expect them to, but they didn't have any idea about technology and how the government could use eavesdropping techniques that are part of the technological age to invade our privacy. For example, when somebody's arrested, one of the first things they do is grab their computer. So that's that kind of stuff can't be in the Constitution. Um, so you know the public officials have to decide what the Constitution is going to really mean for the 21st century. We can't just live in a bound situation. On the other side, here's the characteristics of the unwritten Constitution. It enables modern issues to be handled. Like I said, the government has to do something about gay rights and the rights of veterans and all kinds of things that come up as a result of what's going on in the 21st century. You know, an example might be the technology around having babies. There's been all kinds of cases, for example, that embryos are frozen and then people decide to get a divorce, and you know who then has the access to those embryos. Can a woman, after she divorces a man, can she take that embryo and impregnate her, become impregnated, and then when she has a baby, is the guy responsible? Those are questions that in the 18th century couldn't possibly exist. So you have to allow modern governments to decide it. And so that's what the unwritten Constitution is able to do, enable um, enable us to handle modern issues. Um, and then the last thing here is it gives power, special power, and it expands the power of the President, Congress, and the Supreme Court, because they're the ones who really pass laws, make decisions, and make, decide by action, the president deciding by action, um, that really changed the Constitution. Probably the classic example of the unwritten Constitution changing the written document is that the written document clearly says that only Congress can declare war. And we live in an era, ever since the 20th century, where the president is engaging in wars all the time that are undeclared. So essentially, that power, the power to make a war, is been taken away from the Congress and given to the president, thanks to the way we now operate. Number 3, describe the basic features of the U.S. Constitution. I list them here: federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, supremacy of the national government, a rigid constitution, something we talked about already, bicameralism, judicial independence, judicial review, limited government, and Bill of Rights. So let me just say a little bit about some of these things. Federalism is the form of government that divides power between the national government and the states. There was a lot of worry at the time the Constitution was put together about what powers would still remain with the states. Would they still have power? Because most systems, like a centralized system, would take their power away. So federalism kind of tries to balance it. It gives some power to the national government, some power to the states. We have a whole chapter on this. We'll talk about it later. Separation of powers and checks and balances are techniques to make sure that each branch of government, the President, Congress, Supreme Court, do not have all the power. That in order for each branch to act, if the President takes an action, then that action can be stopped by the Congress or by the Supreme Court or both. So you've got things like that. You don't see it too often because this is a presidency-centered government, but it's there. It's in the Constitution. A classic example of it would be during the Korean War. President Truman tried to take over the steel industry. There was a big strike going on, and of course he needed steel for the war effort, and so he was going to send the army in to run the steel companies, and the Supreme Court told him no, he couldn't do it, and so that's kind of a reaction of both separation of powers and checks and balances. So separation of powers means that each entity, the President, Congress, and Supreme Court, have a limited power, and then checks and balances mean that they need to operate together to pass things. that the president can't do it alone, or the Congress can't do it alone, or the Supreme Court can't do it alone. The next one is supremacy of the national government. What that means is if there's a conflict between the national government and the states, the national government decision or position becomes law. Rigid constitution, I mentioned that already. Bicameralism means you have two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and in order to pass any legislation, you have to pass the legislation through both houses. Judicial independence, judicial review, that applies to the Supreme Court. It means that they are able to operate without political pressure. That's why they're not elected, they're appointed. And the judicial review means that they can decide what's constitutional, that is, whether the actions of the president and Congress are constitutional or not. That's what judicial review means. Limited government means that the government does not have ultimate power, that the power belongs to the public, and that they only are supposed to, limited government means that they're only supposed to pass laws that are absolutely necessary and do not restrict the freedom of the public. And that's probably why libertarianism is so popular these days, because there's so much of a violation of that concept of limited government. And Bill of Rights is, like everybody knows, the rights in the Constitution for individual citizens, the right to free speech and all the rest. Number 4, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. Constitution? The strengths, and here I'm talking about the written Constitution. And in both cases, both of these categories, I'm talking about the written Constitution. On the one hand, the written Constitution, the strengths are that it creates a strong national government. So we didn't have that. With the Articles of Confederation, the states could do whatever they want. Under the Articles of Confederation, the states were like the United Nations. Countries can go there and they can talk, and the United Nations can pass rulings and ideas and even send troops and stuff to monitor what's going on. But for the most part, every powerful state like the United States can do whatever it wants. Classic example was during the Vietnam War, the General Security Council of the General Assembly of the United Nations said that the Vietnam War was illegal and that we needed to stop. And the United States just kind of told them, forget about it, or go to hell, or whatever we told them. But so we couldn't act. That's how it was in the Articles of Confederation. The national government, like the United Nations, couldn't act. So couldn't really do anything. So the national Constitution does create a strong national government, and the national government can do quite a bit that affects the whole country, even though a lot of times states don't like it. Second, it's good for a large and diversified country. The Constitution is vague enough that it allows for some power to belong to the national government, some power to belong to states. We will talk about that in detail when we talk about federalism. Number 3, it provides for orderly change. Very important that we not have a revolution every time there's a major change in government officials, like, for example, when there's a highly contested election. I mentioned Gore and Bush. That was very highly contested. It was finally decided by the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court did decide, then Vice President Gore, he was Vice President then, yes, Vice President Gore acknowledged that the Constitution would have Bush be president, not him. And then the last thing is it provides for stability. The idea that we have this written Constitution, and the Constitution's been with us from the very beginning of the country, all of that is a way of stabilizing things. So when the Supreme Court, for example, says that gay rights is in the Constitution, or it's constitutional, that adds legitimacy to it, and it provides a stability so that most people will accept that, whatever the Supreme Court's saying. On the other side, the weaknesses of the U.S. Constitution, and again, we're talking about the written document. It's hard to amend. We talked about that. Citizens can't vote on policies. Only Congress votes on policies, and the public never gets a chance to face like a referenda on an issue. You see that a lot in European countries, but you don't see any of that here. The public only indirectly can affect policy by changing the public officials, but in effect, they never really have an opportunity to vote on anything that has to do with policy itself. Many undemocratic features, I talked about that already. Much of it's too vague, I've talked about that already. Had to be fixed by amendment. That's almost impossible, as I said already. No support for women, slaves, and American Indians. The Constitution really only gave power and rights, and we're talking about citizens like the right to vote, they only gave that power to white males who owned land when the Constitution started. So those are the only people who could vote, and the vast majority of people walking around, women, slaves, American Indians, they didn't have any rights. And then the last thing I would say about this is it's difficult to enact majority opinion. The Constitution makes it very hard for like public opinion to become law. There are a lot of things the public agrees with, but those things are not becoming law. Like, for example, a classic example would be public support for gay rights, public support for climate change. Those things are not being enacted, largely because the Constitution gives power to other than the majority. And that's another undemocratic concept that we were talking about earlier.